Mr. Speaker, for the purposes of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purposes of debate only. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on House Resolution 843 currently under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased today to bring forward this rule on behalf of the Rules Committee. The rules provides for consideration of H.R. 5063, the Stop Settlement Slush Fund Acts of 2016. The rule provides for 1 hour debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, and also provides a motion to recommit. Additionally, the rule makes in order 7 of the 11 amendments submitted, representing ideas from members on both sides of the aisle. Yesterday, the Rules Committee received testimony from the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and the ranking member of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform, Commercial, and Antitrust Law. Subcommittee hearings were held on both H.R. 5063 and on the topic of the Department of Justice mortgage lending settlements with major banks. In May of this year, H.R. 5063 was marked up and reported by the Judiciary Committee. The bill passed the Judiciary Committee after the consideration of several amendments. The Stop Settlement Slush Funds Act went through regular order and enjoyed thorough discussion at both the subcommittee and full committee level. H.R. 5063 is supported by the Institute for Legal Reform, Americans for Limited Government, and for Americans for Tax Reform because it increases accountability for how settlement funds are spent and helps to restore the balance of power between the branches of government. The Stop Settlement Slush Funds Act was introduced after nearly 20-month investigation by the House Judiciary Committee found that the Department of Justice was systematically circumventing Congress and directing settlement money to activist groups. This bill will help address that problem. The power of the purse is one of Congress' greatest tools to rein in the executive branch and exercise its oversight. It is no surprise, then, that this administration would want to find a way around that oversight and to grow its authority. In fact, in the last 2 years alone, the Department of Justice funneled non-victim third-party groups as much as $880 million. The Department of Justice does this by collecting money from parties who have broken the law and then using that money to create a slush fund rather than sending the money to the victims of the illicit activity. The Department of Justice allows the donations, if that's what they're called, required under the settlement to count as a double credit against the defendant's payment obligations. Interestingly, credit for direct relief to consumers is only counted as dollar for dollar, indicating the importance the Department of Justice places on directing these funds to non-victim third-party groups. For example, the Department of Justice negotiated settlement agreements to the tune of millions of dollars with major banks for misleading investors over mortgage-backed securities, well within what they're supposed to do. Then the Department of Justice said that banks and other parties it has settled with could meet some of their settlement obligations by making donations to certain groups. The money goes to these groups partially under the guise that those groups would provide services to the aggrieved parties. In reality, this practice directs funds away from victims and allows the Department of Justice to steer money to non-victim third-party groups, usually administration-friendly, politically motivated organizations. Additionally, the parties that receive these funds, these non-victim third-party organizations, aren't a part of the case. They don't represent the victims and aren't subject to congressional oversight for the funds they receive. Even if most of these groups weren't activist groups, this would be a concerning scenario. The donations to third-party groups allow the Department of Justice to funnel money to friendly parties outside the appropriations process and outside congressional approval. Many of these third-party groups are unquestionably political and certainly wouldn't be considered nonpartisan by neutral observers. In fact, the mortgage settlement cases like the National Council of Raza received more than $1 million in Department of HUD grants, development grants under the settlements. I don't know about you, but I think that when DOJ requires a settlement, the funds should go back to the victims involved in the case, including victims back home in Northeast Georgia. And if the victims cannot be found or if the problem cannot be directly rectified, then the settlement funds should go on to the Treasury so that Congress can appropriately decide how to use them. I don't think it's acceptable to shortchange victims to benefit special interests and politically friendly third-party organizations, but that is exactly what the administration has been doing. The administration is trying to usurp the power of the purse through these settlement slush funds and has only gotten more confident that they can get away with it. Maybe even more troubling, despite repeated requests for more information, the Department of Justice is refusing to provide it. What little information has been provided indicates that groups that stood to gain from the mandatory donations actually lobbied DOJ to include them in the settlement. Mr. Speaker, listen to what that says. That actually one of the things that we have gained from this is the fact that the groups that stood to gain from these, quote, mandatory donations were lobbying DOJ to get the money. Not a party to the case, not a party to the victims, but wanting their cut of the pie. In at least one case, the Department of Justice restored funding to a program that Congress specifically cut. Congress cut funding in half for a housing and urban development program known as the Housing Counseling Assistance Program. But after grant recipients of this program expressed their displeasure at the cuts, they received a helping hand from who else? The Department of Justice. The DOJ mortgage settlement ensured that despite congressional action to the contrary, eliminating funding for these groups would be restored. DOJ didn't just stop at circumventing Congress's funding authority in that case. Instead, they directly violated the congressional. Again, a congressional oversight overstepped, misused because an agency decided it knew better than the elected representatives of the people. It's time to reassert congressional authority over this process so that hardworking folks are protected from more executive overreach and the separation of powers is restored. At a judiciary hearing in May on this bill, Heritage Foundation scholar Paul Larkin testified Congress identifies precisely who may receive federal funds. That's what we do. I agree with him, but the Department of Justice settlement process in recent years undercuts that critical function of the separation of powers. That's why we have to act and why the underlying bill is so important. The Stop Settlement Slush Fund Act prohibits settlement terms that require donations to non-victim third parties. Importantly, the bill clarifies that payments that provide restitution for harm caused are not donations. Additionally, H.R. 5063 restores the separation of powers by establishing that settlement funds remaining after victims have been compensated are overseen by Congress. Rather than directing money outside the appropriations process, the bill returns the funds to the Treasury to remediate damages after victims have been taken care of. I urge everyone here today to think about their constituents who one day may be victims looking for restitution. I want to go home and tell those hardworking Georgians and our people across the country that I represent that I am making sure that they are put first, not special interest. I hope that others will share that feeling by supporting the rule and the underlying bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.